So, guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Leider wird diese Präsentation in Originalfassung, aber hoffentlich funktionieren die Untertitel von hoffentlich sehen Sie was hier. So this will be a presentation in English. This is a talk I gave for the first time last year in Oslo, but a lot has changed since then. So this is a bit of a remix update or AMC to Zuckerberg reloaded. I'm going to talk about the biggest trends in cinema in the last year, and I have 26 letters of the alphabet. I've got 45 minutes, and I've got 160 slides to get through, so no further introduction needed. A is for AMC, the world's largest cinema company. AMC, as it exists today, was created by the merger of several companies. AMC was the second biggest cinema operator in the United States. They then merged with Carmike Cinemas to become the biggest in North America, and then also bought Odeon and UCI Cinemas in UK and Europe, and finally Nordic Cinema Group in Scandinavia to become the world's biggest cinema operator. As you can see, they have a very aggressive growth target, not just for the existing screens that they have, but with the screens that they want to build and convert. So much so that by 2021, they were going to be close to 12,000 screens, owned and funded by a Chinese cinema chain called Wanda. They were set to dominate, really, the global cinema scene. And then this happened.
Was det en lavin eller?
Ja, den är kontrollerad. Det är såna jäkla krafter.
Är det spett?
Ja, de vet vad de gör.
Pappa!
Det är ingen fara.
Kanske den där aktiverad.
Harry, det är lugnt, Harry!
They know what they are doing. So what does it look like to be buried in an avalanche of bad news? Something like this. This was the share price of AMC at the beginning of last year, when one share was worth over $34. By the time of November 10th of last year, that share price had dropped to $11. So AMC was worth less than 1/3 of what it was at the beginning of the year. Today, the share price is around $14, which is still less than half of what it was a year ago. So this really was a really terrible year for the world's biggest cinema chain. What caused this avalanche? Three things, really. Bad news from the parent company in China, a summer box office of really terrible films that didn't perform, and finally, they had to sell off their advertising arm, or large part of it, National Cinemedia. AMC was not the only company that was affected by this downturn in North America. Companies like IMAX share price also went down, or the biggest competitor, Regal. Although if you look at the share price, something funny happened at the end of the year. AMC's two biggest competitors in the United States and Europe decided that they were going to merge to make this a really bad ending for the year for AMC. But don't worry, there's a bit of good news for them later. Box office. We keep seeing headlines like this, which is that it was the worst box office year in living memory. Yes, true, but only for North America. If you look at the global situation, box office has been growing steadily year on year. And in the most recent year, which is not on here, 2017, global box office touched $40 billion, which is a record. In some countries, it's performed even more strongly. So if you look, for example, at the Netherlands, they had the highest average cinema attendance since 1978 last year, and they had the biggest number of cinema goers since 1965. So it's actually a very, very good cinema year in most countries, but not in the United States or Italy, for example. CGV. I'm only going to mention two cinema chains in this talk, and the other one is a Korean company called CGV. They are incredibly ambitious. In 2005, they said that they have a global target of 10,000 screens by 2020. But it's not just that they have ambitions to have a lot of screens. They have very good screens. This is one of their cinemas in South Korea, in Seoul. They're also pushing other things in the cinema. They do shops, they do gourmet popcorn, they have stores, they have cafes, they have what they call a cultureplex. It's not just a cinema, it's cultural experience. And they've also invented new technologies for cinema, like 4DX, the motion seat, and ScreenX, the immersive cinema format. They're expanding abroad. They have cinemas in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in China. They bought the biggest cinema chain in Turkey, and the first outside cinema chain to go into Russia as well with a deal last year. Dynamic pricing. We've heard a lot about this in the past year, primarily when Regal announced that they were going to be testing this dynamic pricing, which caused a lot of headlines, most of them like this, calling it surge pricing. Surge pricing is what Uber and Lyft does, which is when there's a lot of demand, they push up the prices. So people associate this with being ripped off. However, dynamic pricing is much more complex than just increasing price when the demand is high. This is a slide from Smart Pricer, which explains that there are different ways of doing dynamic pricing, and actually having a mixed model of different charges for different seats and different times is the optimal for cinema. Only a few weeks ago, it was announced that UCI would be rolling out dynamic pricing to all of their sites in Germany, together with Compeso and Smart Pricer. This is a very big step, and it'll mean that we will see dynamic pricing much more widely deployed in cinemas, and also primarily with the other cinemas that are part of the AMC, Odeon, UCI cinema family. And here's an example of how not to do dynamic pricing. This was Village Cinemas in Australia. Already on the beginning of January, they'd scored a big own goal. What they did was they decided to try what they call dynamic pricing, which meant putting up the price of the cinema ticket, popcorn, and Coke, and to do it during the holiday and not tell anybody about it, and then pretend like, you know, it was a good idea all along, and then they had to scrap the whole idea. A very bad way of doing dynamic pricing. They try to do it themselves. They should have talked smart pricing. Experiences. What do we mean by experiences? I don't know how many of you know of Secret Cinema, which is an operation in US, where basically you pay 80 euros to watch a film you could watch for free on Netflix at home. But what they do is they stage these elaborate happenings around the film screenings. So you don't just go and see a film, you actually live inside the film before. So they've done films like, if you look on the top left, the zombie film 28 Days Later, which you watch from a hospital bed in a big warehouse. They did Moulin Rouge. They've done The Empire Strikes Back. They've done Back to the Future, where they built the whole town square. It's really an immersive cinema experiences. And there are other forms as well. Hot tub cinema has been a very successful export from even London to Australia. Drive-in cinemas, beach cinemas, outdoor cinemas, swimming pool cinemas, all of them showing films which you probably have already seen and really wouldn't need to pay that much to watch. But it's the experience of going to see a film reclining in a bed in cinema again, which is taking off. Something unique, something different. And this isn't just true for cinemas. Experience is something that's happening in all aspects of commerce. Retail can no longer be about buying things because you can buy things more conveniently and cheaply from Amazon. So retail has to become an experience. You have to have staff who are more knowledgeable, who can make this something that you want to go out and try, not just sit at home on your smartphone. The word for it is apparently shoppertainment. They're even training sales staff in improvisation, theater classes, so that they can have themes like Alice in Wonderland around a special weekend. F is for film. You're ICTA people, you probably remember film, specifically 70mm. I don't know how many saw the poster for Dunkirk this summer. If you look closely on the bottom there, it says available in 70mm, 35mm, and IMAX film. I think it was available in regular DCPs as well, but they didn't mention that as well. They're making a selling point out of you can watch this in a unique format. Dunkirk was not the first film recently. Obviously, filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson have also been promoting their films in this special viewing format. What's interesting is that this kind of unique experience is not just for film. So last year they had 2 re-releases of films. Fox's Logan, which was released as Logan Noir, which was the same Logan film except with the colors turned off. They did it for Mad Max as well. They didn't call it Mad Max Black and White. It was Black and Chrome edition. Again, it's for people being able to go out, watch a film they have seen before, but it's something unique about it. They can tell their friends on Facebook, I saw it in a way that you didn't see it. And it continues with 70mm screenings of Murder on the Orient Express and The Phantom Thread, most recently in January. G, generations. I won't go into everything about what millennials and Generation Z are in terms of media literate, but you know that you don't see them without a smartphone in their hands. There's been some studies around this, primarily by Munich, together with GfK here in Germany, and Coca-Cola are looking into what millennials want, and I think Guillaume is going to talk about this or mention it a bit later. What's interesting, though, is while millennials do love their Netflix, they still want to go out to the cinema and want to have the out-of-home experiences, even if they're more price-sensitive. Why do they do this? Well, they're an important movie-going group. They make up almost 40% of cinema-goers. And why do they do it? Because they want to get away from their parents. 40% of them want to get out at night and enjoy better technology as well. But getting away from parents is the #1 reason. And here's the other reason. I don't know, can any of you guess what the common denominator, what do these 4 things have in common? Coffee, nail bars, tattoos, wet shave. Anybody? These are all things that you cannot buy on Amazon. That is why you see so much more of these in the high street these days, because regular shops are closing and they're putting in things which are experiences, which are things you cannot buy through e-commerce. When we talk about young generation, though, we should remember that this is not the case here in Europe or even the United States. The young generation is shifting geographically to the emerging markets, to India, to Africa, to Latin America. What we have to worry about this generation here in Europe, the older generation, how do we keep them? How do we get them to go more to the cinema? If you remember the Korean cinema I mentioned, I showed you the beautiful one. That's not the most popular cinema in Korea. It's this cinema which has averaged to 80 to 90% attendance rate, and they show old films for old people, and they charge less. But they have a winning formula of attracting this older generation, which we have to try as well here. A is for HDR, high dynamic range. If you think that I can explain high dynamic range in 1.5 minutes, forget about it, or wider color gamut. I would refer you to an excellent paper written by Tom Burt, who, by the way, is sitting here, who can do a much better job of it than I can do. The important thing is to remember there are 2 commercial varieties of HDR today. There is Dolby Vision, which is very good and very expensive, and Eclair Color, which is also good and a bit less expensive as well, available on different projectors. But HDR is complicated, and it's never as simple as just pushing a button, like they claim here from Panasonic. I stole this slide from Pete Ludet. I is for IMAX. IMAX is the most successful premium large format in the whole world. You can see some of the statistics there of how big it is. What's interesting is that last year IMAX turned 40, so the first IMAX cinema opened the same year the first Star Wars film came out. And if you look at the trousers on the people there, you can tell how much has changed in 40 years since. IMAX has a lot more competition these days. There's 3D, there's Dolby Cinema, 4DX, there is cinema's own premium large formats. But IMAX is holding up its own. But IMAX too is shifting to markets where it's growing faster, primarily in China. Somebody's got an important call. And you can see that that's really where it's taking off in a big way, is the Asian markets. Germany seems to be going backwards in terms of IMAX. J is for January-December, which is the 12-month release calendar. 2016 was a unique year in North America and in most of the world, because it was the first year where all 4 quarters were roughly the same in terms of box office takings. It's not that we had a big summer and then a big Christmas. The films and the earnings were spread throughout the year because studios are starting to release the films throughout the year, not just in the important holiday seasons. However, what's also happening to the cinema is that the Hollywood studios are making fewer films. So if you look at the number of total films released in the United States on the far right, it's gone up by 18%. But if you look at the big 6 Hollywood studios, the MPA members, they have gone down 26%. So they are making fewer films and releasing fewer films. What this means is when you spread out the films over the whole year, and when you make fewer films, you can have a month where one important tentpole title doesn't perform as well as expected, and suddenly it drags down that whole month and gets people talking about box office dying. That's what happened in October with Blade Runner underperforming. You can see there on a comparison to other years, Blade Runner didn't do badly compared to the previous year, The Accountant, but much less than The Martian, the October before. And there were no other big titles released in that month to compensate for the low performance. However, the month before that, it overperformed to 300 million and lifted that month unexpectedly much, whereas normally that would be a fairly quiet month. But the month before that, August, again, very low box office. Annabelle 2 was the biggest hit, nothing compared to Suicide Squad a year before. And I'll show you why. What's very interesting, there's a paradox. Does anybody know which Hollywood studio was the most successful last year in terms of box office? It's an easy question. Disney. I hear Disney murmuring. Okay, yes, you're right. It was Disney. Can anybody tell me how many films Disney released last year? Yes, I actually heard the correct question. Disney only released 8 films last year. And what's remarkable is they have 6 divisions. So these are films from Disney Live Action, from Marvel, from Disney Nature, which is a documentary division, from Pixar, and Lucasfilm. There wasn't even a film released by Disney Animation. I think they were still working on Frozen 2. So 6 divisions of Disney only released 8 films between them. And yet they were still number 1 with those 8 films, even though Warner Brothers, the second one, released 2.5 times as many films. So this is what's changing. And Disney say they only ask 2 questions when they decide whether to make a film. Question 1, do I need to watch this film on the big screen? Question number 2, do I need to watch this film now? Or can I wait to watch it on DVD later? That's how they decide, and that's why they only made 8 films last year. K is for Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. This tweet made the big announcement that after 35 years, cinema is coming back to the Saudi kingdom last year. And it's thanks to this man in the middle, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who decided that it's time to modernize the kingdom, give women the right to drive cars, and return cinemas. It's the large, big market that still hasn't got cinema, potential for over 2,000 screens by 2030 and 30 cinemas. And more importantly, it gave Adam Aron, the CEO of AMC, a reason to smile at the end of the year because they're going to be one of the first companies in there. So a bit of a gold lining to the end. In fact, Saudi Arabia held the first screening this last weekend. They haven't opened a cinema yet. The first cinema will come in March, but in a cultural center, they erected a projector and held the first screening for women and children, 2 animated films. The first films they showed were Captain Underpants and the Emoji Movie. Imagine that, the first film in 35 years, the Emoji Movie and Captain Underpants. Lucky Saudi Arabians. Laser. In China, they have a very good system for people using smartphones in cinemas. They go behind them and then they shine a strong laser light, a really strong one like this. I think that's a great idea. Unfortunately, health and safety in Europe means that you probably can't implement this here. But it's an important laser solution. Now, you might think, why shouldn't I talk about laser projectors? Well, however bright your laser projector is, that screen right there is much brighter. And we need to address that because it is putting people off cinema. M stands for motion seats. There are mainly 4 companies doing immersive seating or motion seating, depends on how you define it. 4DX, D-Box, and MX4D. Now, D-Box has deployed to the most cinemas, but D-Box sometimes only deploys 1 or 2 rows of seats, whereas 4DX converts the entire auditorium to motion seating. So you can discuss which one is the larger of the 2. 4DX is now available in over 400 screens and in over 50 countries. including here in Germany. And last year, almost 20 million people saw a film in a motion seat, which equaled a box office of over $200 million. So it really is a very big trend. N is for Netflix. This is usually, when we hear about Netflix and cinema, the kind of headline we see, Netflix will kill cinema. And yes, Netflix is a killer. Look what it did to blockbusters. Look what it's doing to cable television in the United States. And now it's going after the cinema. They've announced that they're going to do 80 films produced next year. And they won't release them in cinemas unless they can release them online on the same date. And most cinemas say, no, thank you. There has to be a window. So should we be afraid of Netflix? Well, just before Christmas, they released the biggest Netflix production of all time. They spent 80 to 90 million on this film called Bright. And here's what some of the critics had to say about it. So bad it's a holiday gift to Hollywood. Didn't like it. The worst movie of 2017, according to IndieWire. Vanity Fair says that Will Smith even can't save the film. ABC really hated it. Bright is when Harry Potter vomits on a cop flick. But my favorite review is from Daily Beast. Netflix Bright is a $90 million steaming pile of orc shit. They really didn't like it. But Netflix have produced a sequel and they're going to go with it. So, okay, if this is the worst film that Netflix has ever done, what's the best film then? How do we benchmark it? Well, we don't know. We don't know how many people watch films on Netflix. They don't tell us the numbers. But we can look at the Rotten Tomatoes score of some of the top films, like Beasts of No Nation. So let's see how many people here have seen the 3 most popular or the 3 best reviewed films on Netflix. On the third place, Win It All, a thriller with Jake Johnson, involves some money back. Anybody here seen it? Anybody here heard of it? No, okay. Number 2, in silver position, Deirdre and Lenny Rob a Train, 94% Rotten Tomato score. Anybody here watch it? Still nobody. Okay. But the number 1 film, the best reviewed film on Netflix, produced by Netflix ever, with a 95% score, is Tramps. Nobody's heard of Tramps either. No. Because here's the problem with Netflix and cinema. Netflix are very good at making 10-hour films that people can watch in a 1-hour or 2-hour or 3-hour or 4-hour sitting. They're not good at making 100-minute films that people have to consume in 100-minute segments. You can't binge on it for 50 minutes. You have to watch the 100 minutes, but you can't watch for 200 minutes unless you want Bright twice, and then you must really love it. So this is why Netflix isn't really a cinema company. It's a television company. It's a DVD box set killer, not a cinema killer. What's more interesting is what Amazon is doing. Amazon is also releasing films in cinemas, but it's holding back about 3 months before they release them on their platform, like Manchester by the Sea. But they are getting into cinema, and the interesting thing to see is when Amazon introduced the one-click buying for cinema tickets, they're testing the waters as they did with a special preview for Jumanji last year. Oh, open standards. All these new technologies, which will be discussed here at ICTA, one thing they have in common, none of these solutions have open standards or common standards. They are all proprietary technologies with in-house developed standards. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes that is required to launch and make a success of new technologies. And it's not a deterrent from it being successfully adopted. As you can see from this presentation by David Hancock, immersive sound is growing very, very fast, particularly Dolby Atmos. But it is still a proprietary standard. And that's also the only technology where they're pushing for open standards, not because it's more important in audio than it is in immersive seating, but because people remember the audio wars between Dolby and DTS and Sony SDDS from the 90s, and they don't want to go through that again. P is for premium video on demand. Predicted, I wrote this last year, that it was going to happen in the first quarter of next year is the target. This is from the New York Times. But if you look at the title, you'll notice something interesting. The films they're mentioning, Tron, Chronicles of Narnia, this is an article from New York Times from 2010. So they've been predicting that premium video demand is just around the corner for over 8 years now. And we're still talking about it, and it still hasn't happened. In fact, most recently, AMC announced that they are walking away from discussions with the Hollywood studios on premium video on demand because they can't make the formula work. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but it means that it is so difficult so that 8 years on, we're still talking about it being 1 quarter away. What's interesting is looking at consumer demand for premium video on demand. When they asked people, would you pay $25 to watch Star Wars or any other film on the same day that it opens in theaters and home? $25, 25 euros. 2/3 of them said that's too expensive. The price of 2 cinema tickets to watch Star Wars in the home is too expensive. In fact, the only people who said yes, definitely, are less than 10%. So there's not maybe that much money to be made here if people aren't willing to pay for premium video on demand. Q, quality cinema. Does anybody know where this picture was taken? Yes, Picture House Cinema in London, although it looks like a fancy deli or restaurant. We have this one. This is the White Cinema in Brussels. You know, these are not your typical cinemas. These are cinemas which are aiming for much, much higher. And the reason they're doing that, pushing especially the food and beverage, is this. This is American spending on buying things and going out and eating and spending on food and experiences. So both of them are growing. And then here happens the recession of 2007, and they both drop. But what's interesting is after the recession, they go back to growing, but suddenly people aren't buying or spending as much on buying things. They are spending more money on experiences. They're spending more money on going out to restaurants, to bars, to pubs, to clubs, to theaters. So buying things is not as important as going out and having a good time. And this is an opportunity for cinemas. R is for recliners, recliner seating. Forget Bitcoin. Recliners is what you should have invested in, 2, 3 years ago, because the growth of that is phenomenal, and the amount of uplift that especially cinemas in the United States saw when they introduced recliners is phenomenal. You can look at that. They had an increase of over 800% on cash flow on the first cinemas that they introduced recliners to, and attendance of over 120%. Now, as they pushed it out to more and more cinemas, obviously it went down, but that still is seeing a growth of 34% here, and that's in the 5th year, and we're still seeing, significant growth here in the cash flow as well. So recliners is a goldmine. And it's easy to see why. Even though you shrink the number of seats, you increase demand because people then have to go during the week. They can't just know that they will definitely get a seat during the weekend. And it's hard to put an exact number of how much of recliner installation is happening, but here's an interesting piece of fact. Back in 2005, the biggest manufacturer of recliner seating in North America produced 700 chairs per day. That was in 2005. By the beginning of 2017, they could make 2,000 recliners every day. That means yesterday they produced 2,000 recliners, and today they'll make 2,000 recliners. That's just one company, the biggest one, but that's the type of demand that is driving recliner market in cinema. S for Samsung Cinema LED. You've probably heard of this. The biggest news of last year was the fact that we don't need a projector anymore. You can display a film with just a really big fancy television screen at the front. This was demonstrated at CinemaCon. They then deployed it in 2 cinemas in Korea, and they've started to deploy them outside, or they will begin this quarter to install them outside Korea as well. The first one in Thailand and the second one in Switzerland later in the next few months. T stands for 20th Century Fox. You see what I did there? The interesting thing about the deal of Disney buying Fox is that it was predicted by The Simpsons back in 1998. A division of Walt Disney Company. The Simpsons is the Nostradamus of our age. Don't forget that they also predicted the presidency of Donald Trump back in 2000 when Bart travels to the future. And funnily enough, The Simpsons is one of the properties that Disney is buying from 20th Century Fox. Major asset. But Disney buying Fox isn't just about buying Simpsons. There's more to it as well. For example, they're getting first episode of Star Wars. They're getting Deadpool. The Fantastic Four is part of the deal, X-Men and Logan, and of course Avatar is all part of what they're getting. So not just The Simpsons, but all these other properties as well that they're buying. What they're not buying is they're not buying Fox News, fortunately, Fox Television Station, Fox Sports, and they're not buying the Fox lot in Hollywood. They're leasing it for 7 years from Rupert Murdoch. We don't know what happens after that. What they are buying, importantly, though, is the television channels FX and National Geographics. They're buying also the satellite platform Sky here in Europe and Star in India. But perhaps interestingly is they're getting a majority share in Hulu, the streaming player in US. And what else is Disney buying? Disney might actually win an Oscar. Disney has never won an Oscar for Best Feature Film. They've won it for Best Animation. They've never won it for Best Feature Film. Fox Searchlight has 3 of the top films in this year's Oscar race, The Shape of Water, 3 Billboards, and The Post. So they will be acquiring Fox Searchlight's specialty division. But here's the frightening thing, or worrying thing. Remember, how many films did Disney produce last year from their 6 divisions? 8 films. When they buy Fox Searchlight, are they still going to be asking, do I have to watch this film on the big screen and do I have to see it now? The hope is that Fox Searchlight can keep operating under the Disney banner to produce these very good films. Here's a look at some of the other mergers to understand the Disney merger. The biggest one was, of course, AT&T buying Time Warner, but there was the merger also of the biggest television stations in the US, the biggest cable network channels, Discovery, the biggest shopping mall operator sold itself, and of course Amazon bought Whole Foods for a lot of money. But the most important one perhaps is the last one, which is Disney buying out the remaining shares of BAMTech. I don't know if any of you here know what BAMTech is. It's a television streaming technology company that streams National Football League in the United States. But they are also the technology that powers HBO streaming and most of the other streaming platforms in the US. Doing streaming well is very, very hard. It's like dynamic pricing. And for Disney, this deal of buying Fox is all about streaming. It's not about cinema. It's about launching their own competitor to Netflix. In the future, there's going to be 4 major streaming platforms in the United States: Amazon Prime, Netflix, Disney, and Hulu. And by the way, Disney will own 50% of Hulu. It's reaching the consumer directly that matters to them. Because they're not really competing with Warner Brothers and Paramount. What Disney is competing against is these companies, known as FANG: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google. Netflix alone is worth more than every single Hollywood studio apart from Disney. Only Disney is valued more, but it's worth more than all the other ones. And Netflix isn't even the biggest of these companies. Facebook and Google, Apple are way ahead of them in terms of size. This is the future that Disney is afraid of. This is the future that Disney is protecting itself against by buying 20th Century Fox. Unlimited. We've heard about unlimited cards because of MoviePass in the United States offering unlimited viewing of films for $10 per month. Now, MoviePass actually goes back a long time. Before that, they offered unlimited films for $35 and $45 per month, which wasn't that popular. Back then, AMC wasn't trying to sue them, which is what they did when they dropped the price to $10. They were actually working together. But the reason that they dropped the price to $10 and effectively lose money on every single ticket sold is to capture data. They think they can monetize this data and sell advertising to customers, so much so that they're not really a cinema company, they are a disruptor. They are an internet technology, and that's why Wall Street is pouring a lot of money into it, and this is why the share price of the parent company, Helios and Matheson Analytic, went crazy through the roof at the end of last year until somebody realized that, hang on, they're losing money on each cinema ticket, and they have to start making money to make up for it at some point. Also, very sneakily, MoviePass introduced a small change last year where they reserved the right to put the price up or forbid you from watching, say, more than 2 or 3 films per year. They haven't done this yet, but they might have to at some point soon, because at some point the runway will end. They won't have money to keep subsidizing cinema tickets. However, they're already up to 1.5 million subscribers, and they're having an impact on the box office in the United States. However, the unlimited concept is not new in Europe. We've had it here for a very, very long time by companies such as Odeon, Cineworld, York, and UGC offering their own in-house unlimited version. But MoviePass is a third-party operator trying to disrupt the market. And what's interesting is MoviePass, for the first time, forced American theater companies to launch their own unlimited passes, with Cinemark being the first one, where they're going after a different type of cinema goer, really, than the unlimited. V stands for virtual reality. I don't know why they called this cinema, but the first so-called VR cinema opened in Amsterdam 2 years ago, and a lot of cinemas are trying it out now. There will be an Oscar given this year to Alejandro González Inarritu for his Carne y Arena, which was demonstrated in Cannes last year. I don't think it's very scalable. It requires a hangar filled with sand, and only one person can play it at a time. But it's an interesting concept. It's actually creative, getting behind the idea. And a lot of cinemas are trying it, and a lot of technology companies pushing it, as you can see from this chart. However, the thing to remember, or what's interesting, is not so much maybe IMAX and those getting into it, but there are attempts by art house operators like MK2 to actually try this as well. So nobody knows it'll work. Many people are trying it. However, there is one fundamental problem with VR. Can somebody tell me which three are the real and which is the fake one? Anybody want to guess which is the fake one? It's a trick question. None of them are fake. These are all real. These are all proposals for VR that came along at one point. The bottom right one's Toshiba. Bottom left there is Intel. The one that looks something from Alien, I don't know who that is, but that was a real one as well. And we've had this technology actually for a long, long time. It's been around since 1950s. They've tried a variant of that, gradually making them smaller than a telephone booth, and still it hasn't caught on. So maybe it isn't that technology. In fact, even in the 80s, they were pushing it. There was a war of consoles between Atari and IntelliVR. I don't know if any of you ever know who won that war. Trick is they both lost it. And here's why. This was a presentation at IBC last year where they pointed out that we think that immersive cinema means that we have to strap something the size of a toaster oven to our head, which then gives us a headache. But the best comment about VR that I've seen actually came from the HBO show Silicon Valley, where Erlich Bachman, now a famed investor, called it the frothiest space in Silicon Valley right now. Nobody understands it, but everybody wants in. And any idiot can walk into a fucking room, utter the letters V and R, and virtual and VC companies throws bricks of cash on it. It's completely vaporware. I've got to get in on it before it's too late. So, a bit cynical, but maybe it's got a point. Because the biggest game company involved in VR just announced that they're pulling out of it because they don't see adoption rates for them to make money on it. And this is it. There's a lot of money spent on VR, pushed into VR, but not a lot of consumer uptake of VR because they say the maturity of the technology isn't there yet. But they've been saying that for a lot of times. They were saying it with the Atari. Maybe that's not the problem. Maybe augmented reality is the way forward instead, where we have an overlay of reality instead of trying to capture nature, where we can put a dinosaur into the cinema here. W, we're coming to the end. Wolf Warrior 2, probably the most successful film that you've never heard of. Wolf Warrior 2, a Chinese kind of Rambo film, is the second single most successful film of all time in a single country. It took over $850 million in China. The only film to have taken more money in just one country was Star Wars The Force Awakens, which took more money in the United States. Well, Wolf Warrior is the most successful film. Now, this film was a savior for Chinese cinema, which had been going through a bad time, because 3 years ago, we kept seeing this. The chairman of Wanda, flying high, never more so than when he paid $3.5 billion for Legendary Entertainment. However, after that, things didn't go so well. There were vicious rumors about the debt of the company. There was even a rumor that Chairman Wang had been arrested at the airport. This was a full fake news, really fake news. But the markets believed it, and that tells you something about the state of it. And this is when AMC's troubles also began. This is what happened to to Wanda's share price after all the trouble. You know, it flatlines right there. Looks like, you know, a patient at ER when the heart monitor goes, beep. That's because they withdrew trading of the shares after it had fallen too much. But China is still the world's second biggest market. it still has a lot of growth in it, a lot of growth potential. And it is far ahead of Europe and the United States in things like internet ticket booking and other things. So China should not be dismissed. In fact, China is rather going back to being more of a normal country rather than a crazy growth country or a country that will pay you billions to buy your Hollywood studio. And most of it is thanks to Wolf Warrior, because in the last year, China's box office grew 15% compared to just 4% the year before. And people are even again beginning to talk about China overtaking the United States. The kind of analysis they do is not the kind of analysis David Hancock would endorse, because all they're doing is taking the 2 most recent years and then drawing a straight line up. That's not how growth works. You know, if your child grows 1 meter between the ages of 8 and 18, that doesn't mean that they will grow another meter between 18 and 28. But that's the kind of analysis that's being applied to China. Here's why I can tell you that they're wrong. The secret is in the numbers here. I don't know how many of you speak Chinese, but here's the key number you need to understand. This number here, that number is average cinema attendance in China last year. Average occupancy was just 11.1% across all cinemas. If you break it up across different screen sizes, you will see attendance was just 4% for screen or multiplexes with 2 to 4 screens. It was only 7.6% for cinemas with 5 to 7 screens. Now, the big multiplexes in Beijing and Shanghai, they've already been built. Now they're looking at tier 3, tier 4, tier 5 cities with much smaller populations. And they don't build megaplexes with, 8 to 10 screens. They build small multiplexes with 2 to 4 or 5 to 7 screens. So average attendance will mean that China's growth will continue, but it's going to level off. I don't think it's going to overtake the United States. But it's still the second biggest market. And even if it overtakes, it'll be the biggest market for Starbucks in 10 years. So what? X, Screen X. The immersive screen format from CGV, which you heard about, the idea is that you don't need VR or something strapped to your head to get an immersive experience around you. It's not just Screen X doing this. Barco is doing it with its Escape as well. And we're also seeing something from Philips, Light Vibe, which has a kind of mood lighting on the side, kind of like what you have here, except it's dynamic and changes colors based on what's happening on the screen. It's very effective. Y stands for Imagis. We're coming to the end here. Imagis is a company whose name begins with the letter Y. And they've done interesting things. They are Europe's biggest integrator. They're also pushing the high dynamic range Eclair color, but they're also getting into new areas such as esports and gaming. And they've just announced that they're doing their licensing program for the high dynamic range. So we should definitely we'll be hearing more about them in 2018. Finally, Z stands for Zuckerberg. Facebook is obviously the most important social media platform for cinema. As you can tell, 22% of social media influencers talk about it via Facebook or YouTube rather than Twitter or Instagram. Facebook spent a lot of money on getting into the cinema space. Why? Because it's not enough that people talk about films on Facebook because they switch off their phone when they're in the cinema. Zuckerberg would like you to not just leave your phone to one side, he'd like you to live inside the phone. And that's why they bought a company called Oculus Rift, the VR company, and paid $2 billion for it. That's a lot of money. They only paid $1 billion for Instagram, although of course they paid $19 billion for WhatsApp. So they're making a big gamble on virtual reality. This is really the secret reason. I don't know how many of you have seen this picture. Zuckerberg, see, nobody sees him coming. He sneaks up on you while you're trapped in this virtual reality world. And I'm here to warn you, really, because you have seen this image before. Don't let Zuckerberg take away your cinema. Remember to fight it now. That's all from me. Thank you very much.